Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, ich begrüße Sie ganz herzlich hier im Futurium. Wer mich noch nicht kennt, ich bin Stefan Brandt, der Direktor dieses Hauses, und ich freue mich, dass wir am Nachmittag, das ist nicht unbedingt die Zeit für wissenschaftliche Vorträge, am Samstagnachmittag, dass wir hier so ein volles Haus haben, aber auch generell sind wir natürlich ganz glücklich. Wir haben seit der Eröffnung am Donnerstag wirklich tausende Besucher, also die Zahl von 10.000 ist weit überschritten, kann ich Ihnen schon sagen. Wir haben das Gefühl, dass sehr viele Menschen hier in dieses Haus kommen, ins Futurium, ins Haus der Zukünfte. Und das ist ein Ort, so planen wir das, und ich hoffe, es kommt auch bei Ihnen so an dem sich Menschen über unterschiedliche Zukunftsvorstellungen informieren können, sich darüber austauschen können und auch selber Dinge ausprobieren können. Und wir sagen Zukünfte, weil wir auch in diesem Haus nicht wissen, wie die Zukunft wird. Wir sind kein Prognoseinstitut, wir können Ihnen auch nicht sagen, wie die Zukunft wird. Was wir können ist, wir können Ihnen ganz unterschiedliche Zukunftsoptionen, spannende Ansätze, vielleicht auch mal verrückte Ideen auf den Tisch legen, Ihnen die Chance geben, sich damit auseinanderzusetzen, darüber zu diskutieren. Und diese Diskussion, die führt dann idealerweise ja auch irgendwann mal zu einem Verständigungsprozess, welche dieser vielen Zukünfte tatsächlich am Ende Teil unserer Zukunft werden. Und dieser ganze Prozess, der steht im Futurium unter der großen Frage, wie wollen wir leben? Und mit dieser Frage setzen wir uns zusammen auseinander in 3 Programmsäulen, die stehen einerseits für sich, andererseits sind sie auch eng miteinander vernetzt. Und zwar in der Ausstellung, dort werden Zukunftsentwürfe in 3 Denkräumen, nämlich Natur, Mensch und Technik, erfahrbar und hoffentlich auch anschaulich gemacht. Wir haben unser Forum, da ist diese Veranstaltung auch ein Teil davon. Das Forum ist eben der Ort für die Debatte, für die Auseinandersetzung, vielleicht auch für den konstruktiven Streit. In jedem Fall sind im Forum ganz unterschiedliche Formate. Das kann mal ein Kneipenquiz sein, es kann aber eben auch eine ganz wissenschaftliche, hochwissenschaftliche Diskussion sein, wie wir sie wahrscheinlich heute erleben werden. Und wir haben unser Futurium Lab, da waren Sie vielleicht auch schon. Dort kann man sehr viel experimentieren, mitmachen, an Workshops teilnehmen. Gestern hatten wir ein paar tausend Schüler im Haus. Die haben das Haus nicht ganz zerlegt, aber sie haben schon einen richtigen Stresstest mit unseren Exponaten gemacht. Und die meisten Exponate haben es auch überstanden. Aber zu dem Thema, was uns heute bewegt. Denn bei der Auseinandersetzung mit Zukunft, mit Zukunftsoptionen, da spielen Wissenschaft und Forschung eine ganz herausragende Rolle. Guter Wissenschaft geht es nicht nur um richtig oder falsch. Es geht hier um Wahrhaftigkeit in einer durch Neugier angetriebenen Suche, die prinzipiell eigentlich nie an ein Ende kommt. Es geht ihr um Transparenz hinsichtlich ihrer eigenen Voraussetzungen und Datengrundlagen, und es geht ihr um Offenheit für Kritik und Alternativvorschläge. Und das alles, glaube ich, unterscheidet Wissenschaft von Ideologie. Und deshalb nimmt die Vermittlung von wissenschaftlichen Erkenntnissen auch an diesem Haus so eine große und wichtige Rolle ein. Wir wollen hier eben ein neuartiger Ort werden, auch der Wissenschaftskommunikation. Wir möchten Inhalte lebensnah und verständlich vorstellen. Das ist die eine Seite der Medaille, also Vermittlung von Wissenschaftserkenntnissen hier durch das Futurium. Aber wie sieht es nun in der Wissenschaft selbst aus? Wie kann sie sich eigentlich weiterentwickeln? Wir haben neue Technologien, die unser Leben in den letzten Jahren extrem verändert haben. Und wenn nicht alles täuscht, wird es in mindestens dieser extremen Form auch so weitergehen in den nächsten Jahren. Wie wirkt sich das beispielsweise auf die Wissenschaft aus? Wie könnte die Wissenschaft des 21. Jahrhunderts aussehen oder sich vielleicht sogar anfühlen? Welche Rolle werden Wissenschaftlerinnen und Wissenschaftler, und damit meine ich auch die gesellschaftliche Rolle, welche gesellschaftliche Rolle werden sie in Zukunft spielen? Und wie gehen sie eigentlich um mit dieser Wissenschaftsskepsis? Da brauchen wir ja nicht drum herum zu reden, mit dieser Wissenschaftsskepsis, die sich ja doch in weiten Teilen der Bevölkerung inzwischen auch festgesetzt hat. Auch darüber muss man sprechen. Und diese und weitere Fragen, die werden heute auf unserem Podium von wirklich nicht nur hochkarätigen, sondern höchstkarätigen Experten diskutiert. Wir haben hier zu Gast Frau Professor Sheila Jasanoff. Sie ist Direktorin des Science, Technology und Society Programs der Harvard-Universität in den USA. Herzlich willkommen, Frau Jasanoff. Und wir haben zu Gast Sir Martin Rees. Er ist Königlicher Astronom in Großbritannien. Das heißt, Sie flüstern der Queen ins Ohr, wie sozusagen die Planeten sich bewegen. Er war vormals Präsident der Britischen Akademie der Wissenschaften und er ist auch Mitbegründer des Center for the Study of Existential Risk an der University of Cambridge. Herzlich willkommen, Sir Martin Rees. Und man muss dazu sagen, er hat gerade noch im Oberhaus, er sitzt ja im britischen Oberhaus, hat er ganz viel mit dem Brexit zu tun gehabt und er hat versucht, Schlimmeres zu bewahren oder uns vor Schlimmerem zu bewahren und es ist bisher ganz gut gelungen. Bisher gut gelungen. Beide Gäste haben viel zum Thema Zukunftsgestaltung und der künftigen Rolle der Wissenschaft publiziert und entsprechend viel dazu zu sagen. Und ich glaube, auch wenn mich nicht alles täuscht, Sie werden nicht in allen Fragen 100% übereinstimmen, sondern in eine echte Debatte kommen. Aber ich möchte dazu jetzt natürlich noch nicht zu viel verraten. Moderieren wird das Gespräch, was übrigens in Englisch geführt wird, aber simultan übersetzt wird. Ich hoffe, Sie haben auch alle Ihre Übersetzungsgeräte oder Kopfhörer dann auch da. Moderieren wird dieses Gespräch Professor Jürgen Renn. Er ist Direktor am Max-Planck-Institut für Wissenschaftsgeschichte in Berlin und er wird noch viel mehr über die beiden Diskutanten nachher sagen, als ich das jetzt hier tun kann. Jürgen Renn ist einer der renommiertesten Wissenschaftshistoriker Deutschlands. Ich glaube, das kann man sagen. Er ist auch Physiker und Mathematiker. Eines seiner Spezialgebiete ist die Anthropozän-Debatte, also die Debatte darüber, ob wir nicht schon längst im Erdzeitalter des Menschen leben, weil der Mensch eben die Geschicke des Planeten so bestimmt. Auch mit dem Zukunftsthema Nachhaltigkeit ist er sehr stark befasst. Er wirkt auch in einem Lenkungskreis mit, der die Aktionen der Politik beim Thema Nachhaltigkeit kritisch, wissenschaftlich untersucht. Und er ist auch noch Mitglied seit kurzem der Wissenschaftsbewegung Scientists for Future. Und das, wissen Sie, ist ja die assoziierte Bewegung zu Fridays for Future. Herzlich willkommen, Jürgen Renn. Und er untersucht am Max-Planck-Institut den strukturellen Wandel in Wissenschaftssystemen und auch langfristige Wandlungsprozesse von wissenschaftlichem Wissen. Und wenn ich das richtig übersetzt habe, macht ihn das besonders prädestiniert heute für die Moderation dieses Gesprächs. Ich bin also sehr gespannt, was dieses Gespräch an Ergebnissen bringen wird. Bevor es jetzt losgeht, möchte ich vielleicht noch zwei kleine Thesen mitgeben als Denkanstoß für die Diskussion. Erstens, ich glaube, dass in der Auseinandersetzung mit Zukunftsfragen in besonderer Weise auch Fantasie eine Rolle spielen muss. Das ganz im Sinne von Albert Einstein, der 1929 in einem Interview sagte, ich bin Künstler genug, um mich frei auf meine Vorstellungskraft zu stützen. Fantasie ist wichtiger als Wissen. Wissen ist begrenzt. Fantasie umfasst die ganze Welt. Ich glaube, dass faktenbasierte Wissenschaft und Fantasie in Zukunft ein ganz neuartiges Verhältnis eingehen müssen. Zweitens, die Verknüpfung von Wissenschaft und Fantasie kann nur interdisziplinär gelingen, da sich die großen Zukunftsherausforderungen eben nicht mit einem Silo-Denken bewältigen lassen. Und zur Interdisziplinarität gehört aus Sicht des Futuriums auch, dass nicht nur die Wissenschaftsdisziplinen untereinander in den Dialog treten, das ist häufig schon schwer genug, sondern dass die Wissenschaft auch weitere Bereiche mit einbezieht in den Zukunftsdiskurs. Da gehört die Politik dazu, da gehört auch die Wirtschaft dazu, da gehört die Kultur dazu und vor allem gehören alle Sie dazu, nämlich die Zivilgesellschaft, die Interessierten, die Engagierten, vielleicht auch die nicht so interessierten Bürgerinnen und Bürger, denn darum geht es ja am Ende. Am Ende ist eben die Wissenschaft für den Menschen, für die Bürgerinnen und für die Bürger da. Und ich denke, auf diese Weise kann Wissenschaft dann auch dazu beitragen, dass sich eben Menschen mit Zukunftsthemen auseinandersetzen und ermutigt werden, Zukunft nachhaltig mitzugestalten. Ich wünsche Ihnen einen interessanten Spätnachmittag hier am Samstag. Ich hoffe, das öffnet einige Perspektiven. Ich wünsche Ihnen eine gute Zeit hier im Futurium und ich hoffe, wir sehen uns ab heute öfter. Und damit übergebe ich an Jürgen Renn. Vielen Dank.
Ja, vielen Dank, Herr Brandt, für diese schöne Einleitung und für die Eröffnung dieser Veranstaltung. Ich sehe, Sie sind zahlreich gekommen. Das wünsche ich dem Futurium auch für seine Zukunft. Ich werde jetzt ein paar einführende Worte zu Ihnen sprechen und werde dann meinen Mitdiskutanten jeweils 20 Minuten Gelegenheit geben, ihre Thesen, ihre Visionen der Zukunft vorzustellen. Dann werden wir eine Viertelstunde lang etwa hier vorne noch untereinander diskutieren und dann die Diskussion für Sie alle, für Ihre Fragen und Diskussionsbeiträge öffnen. Dafür haben wir dann etwa eine halbe Stunde Zeit. Ich weise jetzt schon mal darauf hin, wir haben eine Simultanübersetzung. Kanal 1 ist Deutsch, Kanal 2 ist Englisch. We have simultaneous translation. Channel 1 is German, Channel 2 is English. And we will lead the later discussion in English. Aber jetzt spreche ich zunächst einmal ein bisschen noch in Deutsch zu Ihnen, um Sie ein bisschen vorzubereiten auf das Gespräch. Und ich kann nur sagen, im Sinne dessen, was Herr Brandt schon angedeutet hat, willkommen im Anthropozän. Die Erde hat sich durch menschliche Eingriffe radikal verändert. Der Klimawandel schreitet voran und beschleunigt sich möglicherweise noch. Die Urwälder, nicht nur des Amazonas, werden abgeholzt. Die Meere versauern und werden mit Plastik vermüllt. Die Biodiversität schwindet durch ein von Menschen verursachtes Massensterben. Wir sind dabei, eine Erdepoche zu verlassen, die uns über mehr als 10.000 Jahre lang eine relative klimatische Stabilität und Chancen für die Entwicklung und globale Verbreitung menschlicher Kulturen geboten hat. Auch mit den Mitteln von Wissenschaft und Technologie, und das wollen wir heute diskutieren, haben wir die Erde radikal verändert. Wir haben zum Beispiel Materialien in Umlauf gebracht, deren Eigenschaften neu und anders sind als die von natürlichen Materialien. Das Plutonium aus atmosphärischen Kernwaffentests wird noch für zig Hunderttausende Jahren in den Sedimentablagerungen verbleiben und dort zunächst zu Uran und dann zu Blei zerfallen. Wir messen aktuell die höchste Konzentration der Treibhausgase Kohlendioxid und Methan seit mindestens 800.000 Jahren. Selbst wenn wir sofort aufhören würden, fossile Energieträger zu benutzen, dann würde diese Konzentration noch zigtausende Jahre brauchen, bis sie auf vorindustrielle Werte gesunken ist. Einige dieser Veränderungen haben sich viel rascher zugetragen, als das bei natürlichen Prozessen der Fall ist. Beispielsweise die genannte Kohlendioxidkonzentration ist mindestens 10-mal, vielleicht sogar 100-mal schneller gestiegen als jemals zuvor in den letzten 420.000 Jahren. Wir sind also in einer Situation, in der sich die Erde radikal verändert hat und in der nichts mehr so ist, wie wir es kannten. Es gibt keinen natürlichen Zustand der Dinge, in den wir jemals zurückkehren könnten. Natürlich spiegelt sich diese Situation in unterschiedlichen Weltgegenden in unterschiedlicher Weise. Aber eines ist jetzt schon klar, am Ende werden alle verlieren. Es gibt kein Entrinnen, auch nicht für die Reichen. Welche Rolle haben für diese Veränderungen Wissenschaft und Technologie gespielt? Wie sind wir da bloß hineingeraten? Ich meine, dass, wenn man darüber nachdenkt, wie sehr sich der Zustand unserer Erde verändert hat, dann lassen sich diese Veränderungen nur vergleichen mit den radikalen Umwälzungen unserer Vorstellungen von Raum und Zeit, zu denen es in der Nachfolge von Einsteins Relativitätstheorien gekommen ist. Und Sir Martin Rees ist ja auch ein Spezialist dafür. Nach der klassischen Physik waren Raum und Zeit so eine feste Bühne, auf der sich das Weltgeschehen abgespielt hat. Nach Einsteins Theorien ist diese Bühne kein fester Rahmen mehr, sondern ist eigentlich ein Teil des Stücks. Es gibt keine absolute Unterscheidung mehr zwischen Handelnden und Bühnenbild. Raum und Zeit nehmen an den dynamischen Prozessen, an den physikalischen Prozessen teil. Und ich glaube, in ähnlicher Weise zwingt uns die Veränderung des Erdzustands zu einem fundamentalen Nachdenken darüber, wie wir unseren Zustand betrachten müssen. Wir müssen in einer ähnlichen Weise einen sozusagen Paradigmenwechsel überdenken, wenn wir an den Zustand unserer Erde denken. Und ich glaube, das Futurium ist ein idealer Ort dafür, genau dieses zu tun. Und wir haben auch die idealen Gesprächspartner genau für ein solches Thema. Und ich weiß, Herr Brandt hat es ja schon gesagt, dass für beide Gesprächsteilnehmer nicht nur die Wissenschaft und ihre Beziehung zur Gesellschaft, sondern auch das Thema Nachhaltigkeit von fundamentaler Bedeutung ist. Deshalb, bevor wir auf Englisch übergehen, mit Rücksicht auf unsere Gäste, erlauben Sie mir noch eine kurze Bemerkung. Angesichts von wachsendem Nationalismus, Populismus und religiösem Fundamentalismus wird globales Handeln immer schwieriger. Andererseits engagieren sich Schüler und Jugendliche unter dem Motto Fridays for Future für die Notwendigkeit radikaler Maßnahmen zum Klimaschutz. Sie setzen dabei gerade auch auf die Autorität und die Glaubwürdigkeit der Wissenschaft, die andererseits durch die Verbreitung von alternativen Fakten und gezielt gesätem Zweifel in Frage gestellt werden. Klimaleugner haben sich bereits darauf berufen, dass Wissenschaft ja schließlich auch nur ein Menschenwerk ist, dass Wissenschaft eben nur ein Teil der Kultur ist. Das ist ein Gegenstand, mit dem wir Wissenschaftshistoriker uns natürlich schon seit langem beschäftigt haben. Sie haben einige der subtilen Analysen von Wissenschaftsforschern wie etwa Bruno Latour zum Anlass genommen, darauf hinzuweisen, dass Wissenschaft doch nur ein soziales Konstrukt sei und deshalb wissenschaftliche Aussagen nur ein Ausdruck bestimmter kultureller Konfigurationen und politischer Interessenlagen. Wie begegnen wir diesen Einwänden? Das ist auch eine der Fragen, mit denen wir uns heute Abend beschäftigen werden. Dear Sheila, dear Martin, I have many more questions for you. But foremost, we want to ask, which role can science and technology play in shaping our future? Which are, in your view, the great open questions, opportunities and dangers? And how do you judge the role of science, technology and society? I would now like to first ask Sir Martin Rees to take the floor. As we have just heard from Dr. Brandt, he started his academic career as an astronomer and is now Emeritus Professor of Cosmology and Astrophysics at the University of Cambridge. And he has dealt in his research a lot with the multiverse idea, and I'm all the more happy that he's now focusing his attention so much not only on this universe, but on this small planet. Indeed, in the last years, he has shifted his focus very much towards the future of humanity. He is, Dr. Brandt mentioned that, a co-founder of the Center for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge, and he has recently published a book that I can only warmly recommend to you. It is to be appear also in German, I understand, and it deals, and the title is On the Future Prospects of Humanity. Sir Martin, it's a great honor, it's a great opportunity for all of us to have you here with us. You have now the stage. What are your hopes and fears?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm going to speak today about the future as a scientist, an astronomer, but also as an anxious member of the human race. I'll draw on my recent book. Doesn't seem to, yes. Called On the Future, where I offer a mix of scientific optimism and political pessimism. And the book's theme is this. Our Earth has existed for 45 million centuries. But this century is special. It's the first when the main threats come from one species, ours, not from nature. We're deep in the Anthropocene. We've an ever heavier collective footprint on the planet. We're empowered by ever more powerful technologies, which can be hugely beneficial, but which, if misapplied, could trigger catastrophic setbacks to civilization. First, a disclaimer. Because I've got the English title Astronomer Royal, already mentioned, I'm sometimes asked, do you do the Queen's horoscopes? And I respond that I'm not an astrologer, and that scientists are rotten forecasters, although not as bad as economists. So my early predictions will be very tentative. But even with a cloudy crystal ball, there are things we can predict. For instance, the population is going up, humanity's collective footprint is getting heavier. 50 years ago, world population was about 3.5 billion. It's now about 7.7 billion. The growth being mainly in Asia and in Africa. And this distorted map gives each country an area proportional to population growth in the last 30 years. The number of births per year is now going down in most countries. Nonetheless, world population is forecast to rise to about 9 billion by 2050. That's partly because there's still a high birth rate in Africa, but it's mainly because most people in the developing world are young, and they're yet to have children, and they will live longer. The age histogram in the developing world, on the left, will become more like it is in Europe. Despite forebodings expressed by the Club of Rome in the late 1960s, food production has kept pace with the doubling population. Famines still occur, but they're due to conflict or maldistribution, not overall scarcity. But to feed 9 billion by mid-century will require further improved agriculture, low-till, water-conserving, and GM crops, and maybe dietary innovations, converting insects, highly nutritious and rich in protein, into palatable food, and making artificial meat. To quote Gandhi, there'll be enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. Population projections beyond 2050 are uncertain. It's not even clear whether there'll be a continuing global rise or a fall. Declining infant mortality, urbanization and women's education trigger the demographic transition towards lower birth rates. But there could be countervailing cultural influences. If, for instance, for whatever reasons, families in Africa remain large, then according to the UN, that continent's population could double again by 2100. And Nigeria alone would then have as big a population as Europe and North America combined. Well, optimists say that each extra mouth brings 2 hands and a brain. But it's the geopolitical stresses that are most worrying. Those in poor countries now know, via the internet, etc., what they're missing. And migration's easier. It's a portent for disaffection and instability. If Africa gets left behind, there'll be multiple mega versions of the tragic boat people crossing the Mediterranean today. So wealthy nations, especially those in Europe, should urgently promote growing prosperity in Africa, and not just for altruistic reasons. And another thing, if humanity's collective impact on land use and climate pushes too hard, the resultant ecological shock could cause mass extinctions. We'd be destroying the book of life before we've read it. Already there's more biomass in chickens and turkeys than in all the world's wild birds. And the biomass in humans, cows, and domestic animals is 20 times that in wild mammals. Biodiversity is crucial to human well-being. But for many environmentalists, preserving the richness of our biosphere has value in its own right, over and above what it means to us humans. To quote the great ecologist E.O. Wilson, mass extinction is a sin that future generations will least forgive us for. So, the world's getting more crowded. And the second firm prediction, it'll gradually get warmer. In contrast to population issues, climate change is certainly not under-discussed, though it is under-responded to. I'll just make one comment. I think the world's CO2 emissions will only come down if countries like India can afford to leapfrog directly to zero carbon energy, rather than powering their grid with even more coal-fired power stations. And therefore, technically advanced countries can help not only by cutting their own emissions, but even more by speeding up research and development into all kinds of clean energy generation and storage. They'll thereby bring the cost down more quickly, so that India, for instance, can leapfrog directly to clean energy, just as they've leapfrogged directly to mobile phones without ever having landlines. So in the energy arena, high-tech can certainly be our friend. However, many are anxious that some technologies, especially biotech and robotics, are advancing so fast that society may not properly cope with them, and that this will aggravate the bumpy ride we have through this century. So, just a word about these. To give an example, in the year 2012, research groups in Wisconsin and in Holland showed it was surprisingly easy to make the flu virus both more virulent and more transmissible. And the smallpox virus can now be synthesized. And gene drive programs can be deployed to wipe out species. A good thing if they wipe out the mosquito that carries the Zika virus, for instance. But even, some say, parasitic imported species like the grey squirrels in England, which many of us rather like. But the danger, of course, is that these programs could get out of control. And looking further ahead, we must keep our minds open, or at least ajar, to transformative advances that may now seem science fiction. If biohackers can one day design and create new organisms, if it becomes possible to, as it were, play God on a kitchen table, then our ecology and even our species may not long survive unscathed. So, biotech will need regulation on prudential grounds and ethical grounds. But I'd worry that whatever regulations are imposed can't be enforced worldwide, any more than the drug laws can or the tax laws. Whatever can be done will be done by someone somewhere. The global village will have its village idiots, and they'll have global range. Cyber and AI raise similar issues. The rising empowerment of tech-savvy groups or even individuals by these technologies will pose an intractable challenge to governments and aggravate the tension between freedom, privacy, and security. On the upside, there have been well-known, exciting developments in what's called generalized machine learning. As most of you know, probably, the London-based company DeepMind achieved a remarkable feat. Its computer beat any human champion in the Chinese game of Go, and subsequently in chess as well. And Carnegie Mellon University has developed a machine that can bluff and calculate, as well as the best human players of poker. It's, of course, the speed of computers that allows them to succeed by brute force methods. They learn to identify dogs, cats, and human faces by crunching through millions of images. Not the way babies learn. They learn to translate by reading millions of pages of, for example, multilingual EU documents. They never get bored. Advances are patchy, though. Robots can do these things, but they are still clumsier than a child in moving pieces on a real chessboard or in tying shoelaces. This robot can turn somersaults, but in a rather clumsy way to compare to a human. And another advantage is that the Go-playing computer consumes several hundred kilowatts of power, whereas its human challenger had a brain that consumed about 30 watts. That's like a light bulb. And he could do many things apart from playing games as well. But sensor technology, speech recognition, information searches, and so on are advancing apace. Well, AI won't just take over manual work. Indeed, jobs like plumbing and gardening will be among the hardest jobs to automate. But it will hugely aid humans in routine legal work, computer coding, medical diagnostics, and even surgery. The money earned by the robots will generate huge wealth for an elite. This must be taxed. And the money used should be used to create, the money raised should be used to create publicly funded jobs of kinds where the human element is crucial and now undervalued, and where demand is huge, especially carers for young and old. We need to offer dignified employment for those displaced from mind-numbing work in factories, Amazon warehouses, and call centers. This needs an economic massive redistribution. This much is a real and much discussed issue, not fantasy. But let's speculate further ahead. How human-like will future robots be? If robots could observe and interpret their environment as adeptly as we do, then they would truly be perceived as intelligent beings to which we can relate. And such scenarios, of course, pervade popular culture and movies. Well, if so, will we have obligations towards them? We worry if our fellow humans, and even some animal species, can't fulfill their natural potential. So should we feel guilty if our robots are underemployed or bored? And what if a machine developed a mind of its own? Would it stay docile or go rogue? If it could infiltrate the internet and the Internet of Things, could it manipulate the rest of the world? Some AI pundits take such scenarios seriously, but others regard these concerns as premature and worry less about artificial intelligence than about real stupidity. But a wise mantra for futurologists is that the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. The futurologist Ray Kurzweil, who wrote a book called The Age of Spiritual Machines, he thinks that humans will one day transcend biology by merging with computers. In old-style spiritualist parlance, they would go over to the other side. But he's worried that this may not happen in his lifetime. So he wants his body frozen until this nirvana is reached. And in fact, there's a company in Arizona that will freeze and store your body so that when immortality is on offer, you can be resurrected or your brain downloaded. Well, 3 of my British academic colleagues have signed up for this. 2 were paid the full whack, 1 the cut price to just have his head frozen. And I tell them I'd rather end my days in an English churchyard than in an American refrigerator. Well, so much for that. And now let me turn just briefly to another technology, space. This is where robots surely have a future, and where I'd argue that these changes will happen fastest and should worry us less. We depend every day on space for navigation, sat-nav, communication, and so forth. And Europe has a strong aerospace industry, and ESA is fully a match for NASA in space science. And indeed, during this century, the whole solar system will be explored by swarms of miniaturized probes, far more advanced than the probes that have already beamed back pictures of Mars, of a moon of Saturn called Enceladus, and of Saturn, and of a comet. There's a comet again, and of Pluto, 20,000 times further away than the moon. The next step will be deployment in space of robotic fabricators, which can build large structures under zero gravity. For instance, solar energy collectors or giant telescopes with huge gossamer-thin mirrors. But what about manned space flight? The high point was 50 years ago, Apollo 11's moon landing. And I chose this picture signed for me recently by 7 of the Apollo astronauts. This was the high point of manned spaceflight. And the practical case for sending people gets weaker with each advance in robots and miniaturization. There's now no motive, in my view, for sending people into space except as thrill-seeking adventurers. Were I an American taxpayer, I wouldn't support NASA's manned program at all. And I certainly don't support a manned program done by ESA. I'd argue that this activity should be left to private enterprise ventures like Elon Musk's SpaceX. They can cut costs by taking higher risks than a Western country can impose on publicly funded civilian astronauts. But there'd still be many volunteers, some perhaps even accepting one-way tickets, driven by the same motives as early explorers, mountaineers, and the like. And indeed, by 2100, courageous thrill seekers may have established bases on Mars. Elon Musk himself, who's I think age 48 now, says he wants to die on Mars, but not on impact. And that's not an impossible ambition. But don't expect ever mass emigration from the Earth. Nowhere in our solar system offers an environment even as clement as the Antarctic or the top of Everest. And here I disagree with Musk and my late colleague Stephen Hawking. It's a dangerous delusion to think that space offers an escape from Earth's problems. Dealing with climate change on Earth is a doddle compared to terraforming Mars. There's no planet B for ordinary risk-averse people. Nonetheless, we should cheer on the brave adventurers who go to Mars. This is why. They'll be ill-adapted to their new habitat, so they have a more compelling incentive than us on Earth to redesign themselves. They'll harness the super powerful genetic and cyborg technologies that will be developed in coming decades. These techniques will, one hopes, be restrained here on Earth. But settlers on Mars will be on the frontier, beyond the clutches of the regulators. So it's these adventurers, not those of us comfortably adapted to life on Earth, who will spearhead a post-human era, evolving within a few centuries into a new species. And that's an exciting and scary prospect. Now, a few general comments on the scientific endeavor, crucial to understanding the world and, of course, to changing the world. If one wanted a single logo for the entire scientific enterprise, I'd choose this, an Ouroboros. It depicts the interconnectedness of microworld on the left and the cosmos on the right, the inner space of atoms and the outer space of the universe. There are links between small and large, left and right. Our everyday world of life and mountains is determined by atoms and chemistry. Stars are powered by fusion of nuclei within these atoms, and however in the picture there's another link because galaxies are held together by dark matter made of subnuclear particles. General relativity and quantum theory are the two pillars of 20th century physics. We need quantum theory on the left, gravity on the right. But they haven't yet been meshed together into a single unified theory, symbolized by the snake eating its tail at the top. But having said that, the richest variety in nature plays out on the third frontier, at the bottom, the very complex, insects, people, and mountains. This is the famous flea drawn by Isaac Newton's least favorite scientist, Robert Hooke, a pioneer inventor of the microscope. I show it to emphasize that even an insect, with its layer upon layer of complexity, is harder to understand than a star or a galaxy. Our complex everyday world presents intellectual challenges just as daunting as those of the cosmos and the quantum. It may seem topsy-turvy, but astronomers can speak confidently about black hole collisions a billion light years away, whereas theories of diet and childcare are notorious for their lack of consensual progress. Because humans are the most complicated things. And that's why only about 1% of scientists are particle physicists or cosmologists. The other 99% work on the third frontier, the very complex. They're held up by the complexity of their subject, not by uncertainties in subnuclear physics. Well, answers to many current mysteries may come into focus in the coming decades, but maybe not. Some fundamental truths about nature could be too complex for the unaided human brain to fully grasp. Indeed, perhaps we'll never understand those brains themselves, how atoms can assemble into grey matter that can become aware of itself and ponder its origin. But to close, let's zoom in closer to here and now, to the social role of science and scientists. Science straddles all boundaries of nationality and faith. It's the most truly global culture. It's the basis for our modern civilization, essential for our survival. And scientists should try to foster benign spin-offs of their work, commercial or otherwise, and they should resist, so far as they can, dubious or threatening applications. If their findings raise ethical sensitivities, they should engage with the public, realizing that they have no distinct credentials outside their speciality. But there are institutional failures. We don't plan for the long term. We don't plan globally. Politicians look to their own voters and the next election. Stockholders expect a payoff in the short run. We downplay what's happening even now in faraway countries. Unless there's a continual clamor from voters or the press, governments won't properly prioritize measures crucial for future generations. Sustaining this clamor needs effective campaigning and enlisting charismatic individuals to change the public mindset. Scientists can sometimes achieve more as outsiders and activists, leveraging their message via books, campaigning, blogging, etc., or through political activity. And to quote the great anthropologist Margaret Mead, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. To give two examples, in my country, politicians, even the unenlightened ones who you hear too much about, they're legislating to reduce non-degradable waste in the oceans. And this is mainly through the impact of the BBC's Blue Planet programme, fronted by David Attenborough, especially the image of an albatross returning to his nest and regurgitating plastic debris, as iconic as a polar bear on the melting ice, though, is for climate campaigners. And it's good to witness more activists among the young. They hope to live to the end of the century. Their campaigning is welcome. Their commitment gives ground for hope. There's at least one person here in the audience who will be alive in the 22nd century. But can we be political optimists? I worry that the way the world is so different from the way the world could be. The gap is growing, as it is between the predicament of the rich and the poor. This is widening and narrowing. Spaceship Earth is hurtling through the void. Its passengers are anxious and fractious. Their life support system is vulnerable to disruption and breakdowns. There's too little planning, too little horizon scanning. Our pale blue dot in the cosmos is a special place. It may be a unique place, and we're its stewards at a especially crucial era, the Anthropocene. We need science, but guided by values that science itself can't provide. And that's a key message for us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Martin, for this wonderful outlook on what a scientific worldview could mean in the 21st century, the scientific worldview of a truly concerned scientist. So thank you deeply for that. You talked about three frontiers, and you mentioned that the third frontier is the most complex one. And I think that our next speaker, Sheila Jasanoff, will deal exactly with that third frontier, the one of the highest complexity, the human world of science. Sheila Jasanoff is the Pforzheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard-Universität. She is one of the most renowned scholars studying the impact of technology and science on society and vice versa. She raises intriguing questions, some of which she will now share with us. She has published numerous books in which she raises such questions in particular about the relation between science and society. Her 2016 book, The Ethics of Invention, Technologies and the Human Future, is a milestone in thinking about science and technology in the modern world. Sheila, since your time at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, you have returned many times to Berlin, also to our institute. We are happy to have you back, and now the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Jürgen, for that generous introduction, and thanks to Lord Rees for opening up such a capacious vision of the ways in which distinguished scientists think about the future. As Jürgen already mentioned, my position is at once more humble. I speak as a member of the public, really, but maybe more numerous in the sense that society as a whole is even more complex than the individual human being that Martin Rees pointed toward. And I think we're gathered in a place that is meant to be a place where not only scientists, but those of us who care about science from many different perspectives can come together and think about not just the next 100 years, but beyond. So I think we might start thinking about the word that is in the center of the place we're gathered in, future, and ask ourselves where futures come from. I mean, to some extent, there was an implicit message in the previous talk that developments in science and technology in areas such as artificial intelligence or genetics, that these are places where the future comes from. But you had an opening ceremony in which the German Minister for Research was present, and I was interested to see that she talked about fiction as one of the places, and she made a reference specifically to a work of what she cited as science fiction. I think technically many people call it more like speculative fiction. 1984, it has become proverbial as a book that foresaw some of the implications of the present developments in information technology, computers, and the surveillance society. So the minister is more learned than some of the people governing my country at the moment, but she still made only a reference to a single novel. And you already heard Stefan Brandt talking about how fantasy has to play a really key role in our thinking about the future. So we could step back and ask what these people who have been writing fiction about the world of the future have really thought about it. So let's look in a little more depth. I think we're all aware that one of the ways in which fictional writing or fiction producing about science and technology has worked is to project rather stark binary visions, black and white, utopia, dystopia, and one can point to a couple of works that I think still have an enormous amount of resonance because of what they say about the ways in which society can organize around changes in science and technology. So on the right-hand side is the image of a well-known American novel from 1888. It was called Looking Backward, and the subtitle was 2000 to 1887. So the author, Edward Bellamy, imagined a person in 2000 looking back at his era and thinking about what that person so situated would see. It is really a piece of fiction that is utopian in its sense of societal harmony. So people in Looking Backward are living at peace with themselves, and it's often pointed out that Bellamy foresaw certain kinds of technologies, such as the credit card, that didn't exist yet at the time. But all of this came together in a far less fractious, to use your word, Martin, social environment than people actually experienced or knew at the time. So I think the book is significant because in imagining a scientific and technologically developed place of the future, Bellamy was also imagining an evolution in society, that society itself had grown in some ways to match the shape of its technology. A very much darker vision is represented in that right-hand image, which is an image taken from Forbidden Planet, a well-known American film of 1956, in which there was a superhuman intelligence, and I'm sure Martin knows this novel because anyone doing astronomy must be familiar with it. This Forbidden Planet was a place where a space exploratory mission had disappeared, and the story is about what happens when other intrepid explorers from the Earth go to find out what happened there. But I think it's a good metaphor for some of these developments in artificial intelligence that we're talking about today, because it turns out that what happened with the very ambitious explorer and colonizer of Forbidden Planet was that using computing technologies, he had developed a superhuman capability and had produced a new kind of being, the Krell. That funny-shaped door represented this superhuman being coming through that door. But the problem with the Krells was that they had magnified not just human capability for the good, as in Bellamy's novel, but human capability for evil. And it's really a kind of precursor of today's Twitter rages and the rise of the populist hatreds, because in a sense, the id, because in those days people were still talking Freudian language, the id had been magnified out of all proportion. So utopian and dystopian visions have been around with us for a long time. The dystopian governs in some sense, but it's worth looking at several different books that have talked about the future and thinking what they tell us about technology. So 1984 has become the one that everybody turns to in today's era of the internet and digitization. But one could actually think about Silent Spring, another book that is extremely well known, not as a work of science fiction, but one could look at it in science fiction terms, because actually Rachel Carson begins with a small fable about what is going to happen to our world, and what is going to happen is ecological destruction, as is quite well known, I think. Kazuo Ishiguro, a recent Nobel laureate in literature, looked at genetic technologies and thought about a similar kind of future. The novel is about a generation of young people who are being raised, in effect, to be organ donors until they die. And then Cormac McCarthy, whose novel The Road, doesn't specify exactly what the catastrophe is, but it's an extremely bleak, catastrophic novel in which some technology that has gone awry has destroyed civilization as we know it. So I call that Imagine Futures 2.0, in which these technologies, information, surveillance, chemicals, genetics, and perhaps nuclear or something else, have changed society to its destruction. There's another way of imagining the future, you could call it Imagine Futures 3.0, in which it's neither utopic nor dystopic, but there's some imagination that the technologies are just going to amplify and magnify everything that we humans have done. So this is the Star Wars vision, in which you have love and sibling rivalry and family secrets, but also imperial ambitions, now bumped up on planetary scale. But society hasn't really fundamentally changed. It's seen as being just how it always was, and we're just doing things on a far bigger scale. It's a little bit like the vision of the singularity, in which Rick Kurzweil thought that all our minds would come together, but not very much about what the consequences would be of that kind of post-human synthesis. But in the Futurium, I think the ambition is to turn the mirror around, not ask, how will the technologies arrive in society and what will they do to us, but rather to ask this other question: what kinds of societies do we want in which technologies are going to play a part? So I think that this is a very important flip of the lens. It is not a flip that you find mostly in science fiction. Science fiction is typically still taking the point of view of the science and technology as being the driving forces. But as we are gathered here together, I think we should be asking what really would happen if society took the guiding role in thinking about the shape of science and technology in the decades to come. Well, what would we think about and what would we look at in that case? The very simple proposition, I think, that somebody like me observes over and over again in the world is that technology doesn't make the future, we do. So these days, in my line of work, science, technology, and society, everybody is talking about automated vehicles, autonomous vehicles, driverless cars, and when the minister spoke 2 days ago, it was one of the themes that she mentioned as well. There's a tick box, a list of about 10 things that you have to mention if you're talking about the future and technology, and that is one of them. Well, as those of you who follow the news closely may know, both Uber and the driverless car are actually in a lot of trouble because both of them have made promises that seem difficult to keep up. Uber has made economic promises about excess capacity of unused vehicular space, and the computerized vehicle has made thus far predictions that are belied by the fatal accidents that have already happened. But this is an image, nevertheless, of technology driving the future, and what I've juxtaposed it against is a bleak picture, more like Cormac McCarthy, from the recent fires in California, the Camp Fire and Paradise Fire, which are seen by some as an example of the extreme events that are coming about in connection with climate change. But you see the car figuring in both of these pictures in a completely different way, depending on how we have chosen to use those and how we have chosen to integrate them into our lives. So there's no single future associated with automobile technology. It is in our hands to do different things with it. So we talk about this now in my sort of line of work as the problem of socio-technical imaginaries. Imaginaries in the plural, futures in this house. The word is Zukunft, not one Zukunft, but multiple ones. And I think that that is something that we have to keep our minds on, because if technology doesn't shape us, then we have the power to imagine different kinds of technological futures. And again, how should we think about this? I think it requires continually re-asking the questions that the world as a whole is being asked to consider, often by the technologists themselves, and to ask them in a different way. So this was MIT our sister university in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It has a house organ called Technology Review, and the first cover story on gene editing was headed, "We can now engineer the human race." There's a lot one could say about this imagery and about the headline, but let's not dwell on that, though we may want to come back to it and question and answer. Very quickly, the discussion has focused around the first question. Is it ethical to engineer the human genome? And even in Germany, the Ethikrat has considered it. This is a topic of conversation. But I think it's more in keeping with the ambition of the Futurium, which I totally applaud, to change that question around and ask instead, what kinds of people and societies would we become if we chose to engineer the human genome? That, I think, gives a springboard for thinking about multiple possibilities and actually thinking about ethics in a much deeper way as part of the fabric of social life and not just a set of principles that we attach. Are we doing harm to the engineered human, or how are we disrupting safety or efficacy in healthcare? What can we imagine with? And again, I think this is a very important thing to keep in mind. I think that the dominance of extraordinary scientific discoveries and inventions in this domain makes us forget that we actually have many, many different avenues for exercising the imagination, not just with the material things we make, even though the cute robots are exceedingly appealing and one likes to play with them, and we have all given our lives over to our smartphones, though maybe less in this audience than in some that I know. But equally we can imagine with fiction, as I've already been talking about, and with art and with music and with film and theater. We can experiment with food, as everybody knows. One of my favorite revolutions of the recent past is the slow food movement, which is a kind of experiment that tries to reintegrate the art of cooking back into a different kind of societal formation, opposing the McDonaldization of our diets and all that that means. And since I am a lawyer by training, I like to keep in mind that a very powerful way that we can reimagine the world is through the law. It's not pointless to say this because it leads us to the next question. And the next question is, who gets to imagine the future? In these days, when Fridays for Future is a movement both in this country and in mine, I've been thinking about other times that children mobilized. And in the 13th century, there was a movement, the Children's Crusade. It was misguided. It was not successful, probably a good thing. But it's interesting that a young man from Cologne is still remembered 700 years later as having led a crusade. And when one looks at the eager faces of the children gathering in the school strikes that have been called, one realizes that it's not just the citizen who's in this carriage here, but the slightly more grown-up ones that are imagining a set of futures that their parents and their grandparents have put in jeopardy to some extent. So who gets to imagine the future? Again, I think it's part of the ethos of this house that it's going to be multi-generational. And I think that these children are going to come at it not with the highest level of science and technology at their fingertips already, but with imaginations that may drive the science and technology in different ways. We're also living, you are also living in a region of the country where these kinds of imaginations have been articulated on a very large scale already. So not far from here is the open-cast mining country, and one of my more provocative sort of exposures to the ways in which environmental sustainability can be thought and rethought is looking at the landscapes that are being altered in places like Kospuden, which is the right-hand picture, where the open-cast mine based on extractive technologies and a destruction of the Earth has been turned into a completely different landscape. So it is possible to reimagine living in the Earth in a completely different way from the ways in which people thought about it even 30 or 40 years ago. It's very appropriate, finally, that we are thinking about and talking about these things in Berlin. I don't know a city myself in which there is this degree of live conversation among layers of history and among different futures. As Jürgen Renn so kindly mentioned, I've been coming to Berlin as a guest and as a very happy almost citizen for many years now, and every time I come, there is some other debate going on, usually unresolved. This morning, I landed in Tegel, and it took me almost as long to get through the line to get into the state of Germany as it took me to fly from Ireland to Berlin. So, you know, clearly the technologies of motion and movement are highly contested in this city, and it's, you know, there is this other airport sitting there, supposedly, that would have whisked me into the country much more quickly. But the very fact that, you know, you have a 21st century airport that is sitting there as its own kind of Mahnmal, you know, is itself a kind of statement about the aliveness of the question, how should we live with technology? And so I think it's that kind of debate, that kind of Auseinandersetzung that is absolutely essential to keep up. It doesn't mean that people are going to come together around a single image. And, you know, with the Berlin-Brandenburg airport, I know that there are very emotional views on both sides of the question about, you know, what its role is. So, you know, is there a space in a city where exactly these kinds of questions about what do we do with the technologies we've invented, from fairly mundane questions like how do we get from one place to another, to high-level questions like what's the future of humanity and the human mind, that these things get debated. So I can't think of a better place than Berlin in which to situate something like the Futurium. Buckminster Fuller is often taken as one of the prophets of invention, and I think that when Martin was talking about Spaceship Earth, he was echoing to some extent a phrase that Buckminster Fuller popularized. And what Fuller said was that when you change things, you have to have a different working model of the thing that you wish to create and the thing with which you want to replace the existing model to render it obsolete. So let me leave you with an image of the place in the Futurium, a place in the Futurium where multiple scenarios for futures will be created. And thank you for being here and showing through your very presence that these debates are not mere academic abstractions, that they are things that concern us all as citizens. And I think if there's one message that I want to leave people with, it is that one that I said, that technology is not the place to look at for signs and hints of futures to come. The place to look is inside ourselves and the ways in which we think, the ways in which we organize ourselves, and the ways in which we galvanize ourselves to take control of the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Sheila, for this very encouraging talk, which has made it clear that we are not just bystanders of technological progress, if you want to call it progress, but can actually shape it, and not the least through our imaginaries. And that's already a partial answer to Dr. Brandt's challenge, let's think about the role of fantasy. And thank you also very much for doing such a good job with the spiritus loci here of the Futurium. Yes, now it's time to come all together for our joint discussion. We are here at the Futurium, a place created out of an amazing idea to bring people together to discuss, experiment, and discover our future, open and free, without the necessities and implications of finding the right solutions under immediate political or economic pressure. So it's a free space that we are discussing. And I'm amazed, of course, to which extent our views converge. And it is now my role as a moderator also to poke a little bit on where the differences between our visions might be. And one difference that comes to mind is, Sir Martin, you made a very clear distinction at the outset of your talk, and you kept to it, between sort of the optimistic view of scientific and technological possibilities and the rather pessimistic view, although lightened by your irony, of the political feasibility of some of these solutions. Now, I also know from Sheila's work and from what she pointed out that she is thinking not so much in terms of different worlds between science and society, but she talks about co-production, she talks about imaginaries that involve not just the scientific community, but society at large. So, question to you is, how optimistic are you, or can you be, if you think of the political side not just as an external factor, but of course as one that is intrinsically correlated with our scientific possibilities? Is that not too much of a neat separation? And I want to sharpen this question by reminding you of a quotation that you made in an interview, and I think you kind of repeated it here. You said, you know, compared to colonizing Mars, coping with climate change is doddle, I think you said. Is that really true if you consider the other side, the political side and the economic side as well?
I think, well, that certainly is true, but let me just say that I think technology is empowering us more and more, but this can be used for good or for ill, so the stakes are getting higher. And we can already provide a good life for all the 7.5 billion people. The fact we are not is an indictment of our politics and our ethics. And that's why I disagree with people like Steven Pinker, who have a sort of a glossy view of the future. There's no doubt that science and technology has allowed us to extend the lifespan and eliminate infectious diseases, etc. But the gap between the way the world is and the way it could be is wider than ever. It's quite correct when people like Pinker say that the lives of people in the Middle Ages were pretty miserable, but there wasn't very much they could have done to improve them. Whereas now, there's a huge gap between the way things are and the way they could be. And for that reason, I think we should contest anyone who claims there's been any overall ethical progress. I don't think there has been. And so that's what makes me pessimistic. I think our political system is clearly not optimized, and we need to reform that. So that's my reason for pessimism. The stakes are high because science is empowering us to do all these things which lead to all these new ethical and prudential challenges. But if I can just add a footnote in science fiction, that I advise all my students that it's better to read first-rate science fiction than second-rate science. It's far more stimulating and no more likely to be wrong or misleading.
Sheila, I found you surprisingly optimistic, I have to say. Maybe it's again the spiritus loci, but you know, if it sounded almost like you know, coping with those future challenges mainly depends on, you know, the right imaginaries, the right discourses, the right involvement of society at large. But what do you say to the many missed opportunities? You pointed to the children's movement. Now, I remember that earlier in the 20th century, children went out on the streets protesting against automobiles, against cars, because they thought they are a liability for their lives, and they surely are. And so we have seen phases in which public traffic has been not left aside, but actually destroyed because the car industry wanted it to be no competitor. We have seen opportunities for solar energy rising just after the Second World War, but they have been destroyed by the interest of the oil industry. So it's not really all about imaginaries, it's also about harsh political conflicts, isn't it?
Well, you know, Jürgen, sometimes I say to my Western born and bred friends that I was born in India, and Indians are often talked about as being fatalistic, but I find that that I'm less fatalistic than many of my raised in the Judeo-Christian tradition friends. And the point is that it's easy enough to list off a series of triumphs and a series of terrible mistakes. And sometimes people see the same object as either a triumph or a mistake. I mean, is it a great thing that Los Alamos succeeded or not? No, the Manhattan Project and the atomic bomb. I mean, it can be seen as, you know, a technically sweet solution to a problem, or it can be seen as having invited a set of difficulties into the world that we're still coping with. But if one puts one's hands in one's lap and says, oh, it's just difficult, and oh, it's complicated, and oh, it's bound to fail, and the missed opportunities. Well, the missed opportunities, I mean, you know, there's a proverb, don't cry over spilled milk. I mean, you know, that happened. So you have to get up and move on. The question is, where will the collective energies come from to allow us to move on beyond the catastrophes that we can all imagine only too well? So if one is imagining a catastrophic future as possible, then one needs an equivalent amount of energy on the other side. There's probably a law about this somewhere, but I haven't written it up yet. You know, and for that, one has to project other visions. So the reason that I was talking about the open-cast minds, I mean, this is a region of the world in which there have been political upheavals of an extraordinary sort, which shows something about human resilience as well. So what does one take away from that? I mean, one could live in that past and be trapped by it, or one could say that it is possible to recover even after catastrophe if one projects a strong enough set of things to fight for. And this is a place where I think I agreed totally with Martin, that the energy of people getting together and actually accomplishing things is ultimately one of the most reliable sources of change.
What do we do to resist the temptation of techno-fixes? You know, many of these big problems, the challenges of the Anthropocene, may call for equally big and equally global solutions. So people talk about geoengineering as a measure. To talk one scale below, nuclear energy. You know, doesn't have CO2 emissions and is being talked about as one of the, not so much in Germany, but you know, there's a world outside Germany as a possible response to the energy problem. So, and it seems to be a sweet and easy solution because it's a technological solution, but when people are discussing it, they kind of neglect the societal implications, which have been very strongly discussed here in Germany, and this is one of the reasons why a majority of the German public has you know, gone with a decision to renounce nuclear energy. So how do we weigh against each other sort of the social context of technology and sort of the temptation, you know, to identify a big problem and, you know, to throw a stone at it that we have at hand, say, nuclear energy or geoengineering and the like?
Mm-hmm. Well, the only answer is with great difficulty. There's no doubt about that. But on energy, I think, as I briefly mentioned when I spoke, I genuinely think the only way in which we will get the world to reduce towards zero its CO2 emissions will be if there is a technological fix whereby clean energy or carbon-free energy, in which I would personally include nuclear, becomes as cheap and as safe as coal-fired power stations, and then everyone will choose to use them. I'm pessimistic about any other way of cutting CO2 emissions. So that's an example where I think we do need a technological fix, and then everyone will welcome this new clean way of getting energy. So that's why I think there should be a huge emphasis, spending as much in developing clean energy as we spend on health research or defense research. We're spending far less on either. So that's what I say. Another point I'd like to make, really, going back to my grounds for pessimism, is that it's true that Sheila mentioned ways in which we can sort of revive, etc. But I think there's something new now, which is that we are so interconnected that we can't have a catastrophe in one part of the world without it affecting the rest. Probably many people know Jared Diamond's book called Collapse, where he talks about, in particular, 5 different collapses in different areas. I think now we couldn't have a collapse in one continent without it affecting the entire world because of the, not just financial system, but just-in-time delivery and transport and everything else links us all together. And that's why the risk of a global setback is something which didn't exist in the past because different parts of the world were entirely non-communicating almost. Whereas now there's a risk of a global setback, and getting out of that is going to be much harder than for a single region to survive because there's no external help available. So that's something which is new. So it's the greater empowerment by technology and the greater interconnectedness. And going back to empowerment, I go back to law and regulations. There are, of course, serious discussions about the ethics of genetic modification. Sheila mentioned this, how we should use it, and is human enhancement to be allowed or not. My concern is that whatever regulations are agreed by all nations can't be enforced. I say we can't enforce the drug laws globally, we can't enforce the tax laws globally, and someone somewhere will do these things, whatever we want, and the point is that the power is such that the actions of a few people can cascade globally. We see this in micro scale through cyber attacks, where one person can produce a very substantial damage to a social system or an industry, and that's just a portent of what can happen on a bigger scale and far more frequently in both cyber and in bio in future.
And not only, if I may add to that, what you say is very much in agreement with the Earth's system science say, that if we go on with global warming, we might reach tipping points.
Well, indeed, that's the other point. That the science is uncertain, and it's obviously too simple to think of a linear response. It could be, and in fact, I heard Professor Schnellhuber giving a talk where he made the point that it could be that we are already going to go to a very different state, because it could be that there's one equilibrium we're in, yes, and maybe 2 degrees of excess warmth is not an equilibrium. It'll overshoot and go up to 4. That's quite possible. So we just don't know, and all we can say is that this is a case when we've got to be as precautionary as possible, simply because we can't predict the consequences of what we are doing. And of course, you mentioned geoengineering as another technical fix, and that's the reason for being very, very cautious about doing that.
Sheila, are you optimistic that democratic societies can cope with these global challenges?
Well, so in a sense, I don't want to get drawn into a discussion framed in terms of pessimism and optimism, because I think that that's too simplistic in a way. I mean, there's in a given day, how many moments does each of us spend being either optimistic or pessimistic, depending on the last conversation we've had or the last piece of food we've eaten or whatever. So anyway, I just don't think that that's a helpful direction. But I don't think we should leave the technological fix discussion without saying a few things and without invoking the spiritus loci, as you mentioned before. Because, first of all, technological fix in its singularity, I think, is contradicting the spirit of this place. It suggests that there is a one-size-fits-all, what one calls a silver bullet solution. Remember, the vampire used to get shot with a silver bullet, and that took care of it. And if history tells us anything in the evolution of technology, it's that anything that's been tried as a technological fix has not worked. And if one looks at the recipients of development projects all around the world, one can find many, many examples. So partly, I think one should instantly pluralize everything that is a singular and say technological fix is, and that automatically reduces the scale. That is, one is not thinking of one worldwide global solution, whether it's transporting us all to Mars or doing geoengineering or whatever, that one has to keep the alternatives alive. But the second and much more important move is to recognize that anything that counts as a technological fix is at the same time a sociological fix or a societal fix. It's benefiting some people. All of these technological developments that we know from the beginning of the 20th century onward, the ones that have given us longer lives and so forth, they have also exacerbated inequality. And you can take any area, whether it's public health or longevity or diet and nutrition, and everywhere you see that the capabilities that we have map very cleanly onto global inequality in all kinds of ways. So why is that? And I think you already pointed to the connection between money and power and knowledge, and one can't forget that. So I think the technological fix language is dangerous in a way because it takes our attention away from the fact that technological fixes are power fixes. It's somebody's idea of what a problem is, what the fix is, and what the right technology is. And I think it was irresponsible to let loose nuclear energy on the world while shoving the problem of nuclear waste and proliferation and indeed safety as if they didn't belong and as if they should not be discussed. And to this day, that same thing is going on around even a familiar technology like the nuclear. And I think we have to become far more critical consumers of technological systems and recognize ourselves in them as part of the problem.
That's a great remark on which we can finish this round of internal discussion. Und ich wende mich jetzt an Sie auf Deutsch. Sir Martin, you might wish to use the translation. Sheila Jasanoff versteht uns perfekt auf Deutsch. Aber das ist jetzt so der Augenblick, meine Damen und Herren, wo es gibt auch ein Mikrofon, das wir dann, ich habe Sie gesehen, das wir zu ihm bewegen kann. Ich muss ein bisschen so die Hand so halten, sonst bin ich geblendet von den Scheinwerfern. Aber hier gibt es einen Herrn im blauen T-Shirt, der hat sich schon gemeldet. Vielen Dank. Und ich warte jetzt, dass Ihnen das Mikrofon näher kommt. Wenn Sie die Hand nochmal heben, dann weiß man, wo es hingehen soll. Und Sie können Ihre Frage auf Deutsch oder auf Englisch stellen. Wir haben Simultanübersetzung.
Berthold Kuhn, Freie Universität, Berlin. I'm a political scientist at the Futurium, and at today's sessions we are talking about the futures, not a single future, and it is probably impossible to establish a global consensus about what will be the future. So I would like to know from you, in particular Mrs. Jasanoff, how does it play out on geopolitics? Where does the future come from? From the East, from the West, the socio-technical imaginaries of the East or of the West? Which one will prevail, or how do you see the configuration of geopolitical conflicts on the issue of what future do we want?
Thank you. It's an excellent question to put to a person who has made a career out of criticizing the hubris of prediction and whose most famous article is called Technologies of Humility, because I think the predictive sciences have taken on too much. So I will not tell you what's going to prevail. I will tell you what I think is lacking, which is a sufficiently critical and reflective perspective on each of these futures. I mean, first of all, there isn't any such thing as East and West. It's not that simple, partly for the same reasons of interconnectivity that Lord Rees was talking about, because one finds elements of these things everywhere. So, but one can say, well, which ones are succeeding and which ones not? So, for instance, one can say that there is a huge amount of power and galvanizing behind solutions that seem to address large problems on a large scale. Our undergraduates, for instance, at Harvard, are continually being told to think about solutions that affect 1 billion people. I mean, maybe that is just the wrong scale. Maybe one should begin somewhere else. And if one does that, then those imaginations are more likely to come from the global south than from the global north, for whatever reason. It may be because of the history of industrialization going a certain way, the history of mass production, and so on. So one can point to specific places and technologies. I mean, I take your point about the multiplicity extremely seriously. When one is talking about food systems, it may be a very different problematic from when one is talking about pandemics, and that may be a very different problematic from renewable energy. So one has to take these things, as systemic socio-technical objects of analysis and see which kinds of questions are being continually sidelined. And I think one would find some patterns.
Vielen Dank. Weitere Fragen? Hier vorne. Wenn Sie eine Sekunde warten, das Mikrofon, ich zeige dann immer auf Sie, dann es kommt von da, von links, von Ihnen aus gesehen.
Hi, great talk, both of you. So, yeah, I have a question. Is there a parallel universe where all the children are striking, and is it better so far? And a second question, will you both be traveling to the US on a small sailing ship next time you have to go to the US?
Well, the sailing ship thing has obviously been much in my mind, and I've wondered, what exactly is the value of me coming across the ocean. It's the carbon footprint left by my distinguished colleague here is smaller than mine, so these concerns are not out of my head. I will tell you that for all of the vaunted power of digital technologies, I know that my capacity to build an intellectual field in which people question certain kinds of constellations of materiality and power, technology and society that have never been questioned before. It would not have happened if I were not personally able to go to places. So, and also, as you can see, I'm a child of many migrations. I speak English in a way that would not have happened if a certain empire had not reached its hand across to where I was, and they came by sailing boats. And my daughter is the author of a highly regarded history of Joseph Conrad, and she took a trip on a sailing ship, to get the flavor of what that was like. So, should all the children be striking all the time? Well, in Hong Kong they are. It depends on what the purpose is. There are times to go into the streets, there are times to lay down one's life, and there are times to strike and break the law. In law, we always think about when disobedience is actually a form of higher obedience, but it comes back to the point about ethics, right? I mean, that is, we have to reflect on what the values of the moment are and which ones are being promoted and which ones are being obliterated, and it's not the case that we live in a perfect world. So I think it does come back to having to question oneself, one's societal formations deeply. This is what I like about Berlin, that these questions are not so buried and taken for granted, but that something about this city actually keeps some of the motion alive.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Can I make a comment on that?
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Meanwhile, we transport the mic to the end of the room.
Well, 2 points. I mean, I think campaigning by the young is important, because the main problem with all these discourses about carbon and environment is that people apply a steeper discount rate than they should. You apply a discount rate if you're making a business decision to put up an office building or something, but you should not discount the future. You should not discriminate on grounds of date of birth. And that's why you should care about what happens 50 or 100 years from now in these contexts. And I think young people are reminding us of that. That's one point I wanted to make. And the second point regarding travel is that I hope we can reduce the incentives to travel by IT, etc. Because it's pessimistic to say that any economic growth requires more resources and energy. Microelectronics and IT, etc., has been less demanding of resources, except of certain rare earths, than earlier technologies. So we can surely encourage further developments of virtual reality and distant communication, etc., because that will be something which enhances everyone's quality of life without using more resources and energy.
I would just, I'm not sure whether I would agree on a natural scientific point with you, because actually microelectronics is, very demanding in terms of materials. It's also poses,
yes.
it is a huge
and data centers use lots of energy.
They consume a lot of energy. There's a waste problem.
Yeah.
So we should more generally think about circular economies, which is a very one of your complex phenomena that you mentioned. But there was a question back there.
One question to Sheila Jasanoff. You mentioned that we want to, that we have to shape our own future, that we have to think about what technology can do for us and not like what technology does for us. But there's a one point when, I mean, we are doing research, and we are doing research about the problems the society is facing. Like, we want to have a vaccine against polio, we want to have better treatment for this and that, we want to have better solutions for energy. So the society creates a problem or thinks about a problem, and this is what the research is then most focused on. And on the side project, there comes much, much more knowledge than we were actually asking for, like gene editing. So where does the society has to then stop in again and think about what will come out? Because as we don't know what's coming out when we are starting research. So in your point, you're making the statement, what kind of technology and society do we want to have in the future? But on the way to that, there's always coming new technology which we don't know how to deal with, and we don't know, like for the atomic bomb and the atomic power, that we don't know the exactly consequences while we are doing research about that. So where does the society have to step in? What do you think is the best point in that?
Thank you for your question. Sheila, the question is to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think that there's a huge temptation to want to know it all and have the solutions, and I think that is something we have to acknowledge that we do not have within our grasp. I mean, so it's not, the point of reflecting on what kinds of societies do we want is not that we will therefore come out with the perfect model of a society. I mean, think of the great religions of the world. Each one is founded on some deep questioning about what kind of society do we want, and they have done some good and they have done a lot of ill as well. And in a way, the scientific and technological era is its own kind of religion, and it too has promises, some kept and some not kept, and some having done good and others not. I don't hold with the formulation that I know you don't mean, but the one that is often called a societal lag or a law lag, which says that the technologies are leaping ahead and we as societies are continually lagging because we don't know what to do with them. It turns out that we do know very well what to do with them. I mean, you know, there's a reason why a decade after something like Facebook takes hold, we start worrying about whether it's got monopoly control. And now, you know, in the last year and a half or so, there's all kinds of talk about Silicon Valley and about the data oligarchs that have grown up there and so on and so forth, as if we didn't know. But we did. We decided that it was okay to give over our data and create a system of property law in which these would be unregulated industries. Were some people talking about the bad idea then? Yes, they were. Why were they not being listened to? Because there are ideologies that are not just scientific ideologies, but also economic ones. And the question is not, you know, which one is going to prevail, which one not, how can we get to the perfect world, but how can we become a more self-critical world? And, you know, not everything is going to work out for the best, it never does. But at least one could have more of a sense that we haven't created a world in which we're so enamored of the technique that we just let it take over without asking, you know, who invented it, who asked for it, gene editing is not happening just by itself. It's happening because there's venture capital and people are paying for certain kinds of developments. People are fighting patent battles on both sides of the Atlantic. And, there are stakes involved. Supposing one focused on those stakes and started seeing something about whose benefit gene editing is being used for, and how does it compare with the biotech revolution of 20, 30 years ago, and are we repeating the same problems of the haves and the have-nots? I mean, I think there's a lot that we know that we could be asking that tends to get muddled if we have this feeling that we're continually disempowered by the very speed of development that's keeping us continually off balance.
Mm-hmm. So, Martin,
yes.
Comment on this.
I just wanted to say that scientists have no special credentials in ethics or economics, so the way in which the science is developed should be the matter of a public discussion. But the scientists may be the first to have a feel for what's going to happen, and they have an obligation, therefore, to interact with politicians and the public. I think this is not happening adequately in the case of gene editing now, which has huge ramifications. But to take one example where it worked well in our country, which was embryo research, the discussion which led to the 14-day limit for embryos. That was the result of dialogue between some philosophers, the scientists, and parliamentarians, and they came to a consensus that was agreed. In terms of GM crops, we didn't do so well, but that's an example that if you can get in and have a debate before there's a standoff between the commercial exploiters and other extremists, then you can come up with a consensus. And the scientists have responsibility to encourage that wide discussion.
The question, if I may add, also Harvard, though, in the way that I understood it, a different perspective, namely the perspective that science doesn't just offer solutions to problems, answers to questions, but has a spillover effect of knowledge. So science, in a way, is perhaps the most powerful source of new imaginaries that we couldn't have planned. So it gives us new perspectives, and we have to respond to them, then not just individually, not from the scientific point alone, from societal point as well, but we should be prepared that it's opening up new horizons all the time. But there was another question here. Could you raise your hand so the mic can move to you? Und da Sie alle so perfekt Englisch sprechen, das finde ich wunderbar, das erspart unseren Übersetzern viel Arbeit. Aber das macht überhaupt nichts, wenn Sie auch mal auf Deutsch fragen, weil wir haben eine tolle Übersetzung hier im Hintergrund. Ja?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I have figured out my question in English now.
So go. It didn't mean to stop.
Okay, it goes in a similar direction what Sheila talked about. I got the impression that we talked about a lot about the consequences, the implications, the challenges of science, and I'm interested in the conditions of science, the social, economic, and institutional conditions for science. And my question is, what is your vision? You gave a hint about that scientists are not only publicly funded, democratically controlled group of people, but you mentioned the Silicon Valley venture capitalists, and I would open up the third direction. It's citizen science, and my question is, what is your vision for science? Who are going to be the scientists, only experts paid by big multinational corporations doing high tech, or is there also a vision for a vast citizen movement doing science?
Thanks. Citizen science, historically over 150 years, has often been not much more than citizens being enrolled into scientific projects that are already being done by other people. There is, of course, a different kind of citizen science that has arisen around problem areas, like people measuring their own pollution levels, for instance, and pointing out that they're living in dangerous circumstances that nobody thought to care about. But, when all is said and done, the practice of science and technology today does require huge investments at the frontiers. For all that people are talking about biohacking and doing it in your garage or whatever, the scale up to produce something is still something that that costs a great deal. So I am not, I mean, you know, this would take far too long and isn't a sort of public Q&A thing, but I'm not, I mean, of course citizens should be alert and skeptical, observers and consumers of what is happening in the scientific and technological enterprise. I don't see that citizen science in the way that term is technically used is the answer, but a public science might be. And I think that in each country, certainly mine, one can look at the ways in which science and technology are being funded and find such big pathologies that one doesn't need to get into the nitty-gritty. So one area that we haven't mentioned is the entire military funding of science and technology, which has been around with us for a very long time, but it has spillover effects. I mean, you used the term, but the kinds of spillover effects that concern me. I mean, for instance, the arms trade, you know, is part of the face of massive overproduction of weapons of small and mass destruction in the rich countries of the world. And by and large, this is completely unregulated and unsupervised. And in America, part of the spillover effects is that municipalities, city governments have now become, you know, sort of armed enclaves. I mean, you know, a city can practically drag out a tank, you know, because there's just excess military stuff lying around. So who funds the science and technology? It's not just the question of the corporate sector. I mean, that has enormous implications for what kinds of scientific and technological objects are being produced. And to some degree, I think scientists have shown that they get caught up in the excitement of the moment, of the discovery. We've already had that kind of debate over the enhancement of lethal properties in bacterial research, for instance. I mean, there are bland names like gain of function. I mean, who knows what gain of function means? It means making creatures that are capable of leaving the lab and destroying huge populations. So it's not citizen science you need, it's citizen attention that you need to see what contextual factors bring about an uncritical set of developments of that sort that, you know, can burst into problematic proportions before anybody even knew a word about it.
Yes. Well, for those reasons, all the public needs to have a feel for science, so they can't be bamboozled by fake claims and can participate in debates on the ethics and the applications, like genetics. So that's crucially important. But on the actual creation of new scientists, new science, I think we should bear in mind that the research university, invented in Germany 200 years ago, has been probably for the last 50 or 100 years the main way in which academic science and indeed pure science has advanced. And the aim has been then to have the research done by academics who also educate the next generation. That's the most efficient system, and we should stick to that. But it can be supplemented now by, I don't know if you call it citizen science, but more other ways in which people who are outside institutions can contribute to science, can follow science, and indeed there are going to be more people who may have made money in some other way and want to be scientists, and they could be genuine professional scientists. Just in the 19th century, Darwin, Lord Rayleigh and others were world-leading scientists, and they were entirely privately funded. I don't see why we shouldn't have an emergence of a class of people like that as well, and that'll be a plus.
A plus. I think that's a wonderful word to end this discussion. We are at the end of our time. I think we have heard a lot of very inspiring and, if I may say so, optimistic sounding and optimistic promising views about the future. In particular, it has been an encouragement to engage with the future, to engage with what is happening here at the Futurium. I may take the liberty, Brandt, to thank you all in the name of the Futurium for coming here, our prominent guests. So I think they merit an extra final applause from you.
Thank you very much.
And we thank you all. We thank you all for coming, for engaging with the discussion. This is just the beginning. Come back soon. Thank you very much.